What about, though, the maritime element in this? I did mention it early on, and I am very interested in this because relative to what we've seen, the proclaimed wins for the Russians on the terrestrial side, the Ukrainians, by actual default, are literally making the Black Sea a graveyard for naval assets of the Russian Navy.
Left the Black Sea, they're hiding behind their bridge in the Sea of Azov. And soon they're not even going to be safe there. Once F-16s arrive, they're going to get anti-ship missiles. I don't know the range and how far it is for an F-16 to get close to the Zaporizhia front. All of these ships are going to be destroyed. It's just a matter of time. As long as Russia continues this war, they're going to lose everything.
This is the Global Gambit.
All right, well, the Ukrainian front is as dynamic as ever, but not just on the line of contact, across borders, or in and around Crimea. There is a lot happening in the militaristic sense with the continued Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And there's quite a lot to unpack at the halfway point in 2024. And I couldn't think of someone better to do that than the wonderful Jake Bro. He's joining us again for part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, well, open a tab and go and watch that, or watch both of them. Well, no, don't watch both of them together. That sounds horrible. But it is Jake Bro. He is a United States Air Force veteran who served as a nuclear and missile operations officer, 13N, and is a proclaimed, rightly so, a YouTuber who does incredible coverage of Ukraine on a regular, almost daily basis. Jake, thank you very much for joining for part 2. I guess just jumping straight into it, really.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, there's so much to keep track of, and I had to do this on a regular basis. I've also been enjoying your live streams, but in terms of what you've been watching at the moment, obviously we could talk about every incremental change on the front line, but in terms of the most major developments in recent days, weeks, what would you pinpoint?
The last 3 months have been pivotal. Ever since Congress passed that $60 billion in aid back in late April, it's completely changed the battlefield. It was excruciating for me and everyone paying attention to these daily updates from about December of last year to April. MAGA was blocking military aid in Congress. The Ukrainians were out of ammunition. They needed the resources. But since that bill has passed and supplies have started showing up, Russia's made no significant gains on the battlefield. They took Avdiivka back in January or February. They were making this breakthrough in Ocheretny. The Ukrainians just didn't have the ammunition. They didn't have the artillery shells to stop them. But damn, the last 2 months have been completely different. Russia thought they were catching the Ukrainians off guard. They reinvaded the Kharkiv Oblast. If their goal was not to take the city of Kharkiv, it was at least to get within artillery range, to create a new buffer zone, as Putin stated. A buffer zone would be like 30 kilometers deep. They've gone 5. This has been a complete catastrophe for the Russian military, and I'm enjoying every second of it, watching them fall flat on their face, not being able to take Lipsy, and not being able to take even the north bank of Vovchansk. So Russia was confident the United States was not going to flip their position on Western weapons being used on the territory of Russia. It flipped. We haven't been nuked. There's been no nuclear war the last 2 months in response to GMLRS and artillery being used on Russian territory. These are weapons donated from the United States. So I do think Russia thought this was to their advantage. They had a cheat code in which they could amass their forces on their side of the border, conduct their attacks, and then their fuel warehouses, their ammunition depots, their command posts were safe. And the last two months, they've just been lit up. It's been an absolute catastrophe. So I do believe Ukraine avoided a reinvasion of Chernihiv and a reinvasion of Sumy. The Russian forces are still sticking it out for political reasons in the small sliver of territory they've taken in Kharkiv. But they're not going anywhere. They're not going to make any progress. This was Russia's big summer offensive. We're in July, and Russia's not going to make any progress on the battlefield to crow about.
Yeah, he was notable in, I would say, April, May, the turn of the weather that, can really begin to be the initiator of sort of some ground offensives. We talked about those gains that the Russians seem to be making around Kharkiv, and then all the pro-Kremlinites were like, oh, Russia's going to sweep them. And suddenly they've gone very quiet and there's not much really happening up there. How much is that, do you think, to do with the cross-border strikes into and around Belgorod? Or is it more to do with the fact that the Ukrainian defensive lines within Ukraine?
Everything. Russia can't get armored vehicles to Vovchansk without them being blown up on the way there. It's not just military aid from the United States. It's the Czech-led artillery initiative. They've already received close to 100,000 rounds this month. They're going to start receiving 100,000 extra rounds every month for the foreseeable future. But then it's also Ukraine's insane domestic production of these cheap FPV drones, costing $400 or $500 per unit.
Wow.
These drones are everywhere. I mean, these drones are the absolute nightmare. When you see these recorded videos of Russians, they're not sleeping too great because they've already seen a buddy or two get blown up by a kamikaze FPV drone. So these FPV drones, they go after absolutely everything. Everything that moves is a target. But yeah, Russia can't even get armored vehicles to Vovchansk to help them in the city because they get blown up before they even get close. I think Ukraine is on the right path. I think they've found a winning formula. Their ability to get these drones and these components and assemble them and get them to the front is a lot better than the Russian side because Russia is still restricting access to the internet because they don't want their soldiers talking to people. They don't want their soldiers to have smartphones because then they can record videos or call their loved ones at home. So Ukraine has a huge leg up, Starlink being one, but the ability to use their phones and the internet and technology to communicate and coordinate, this is something the Russian military still does to control information, to keep their soldiers in line. It's a slave army.
And what of the claims, I think at the time of recording again, we've seen, I want to come a little bit more to Crimea, specifically later on, that notable beach strike. But what about this claim from the Russians that they do make incremental gains, across a specific city, sort of literally we're talking about centimeter, but it's a symbolic or Pyrrhic victory, I think, really. But what do we make of these claims suddenly? Are we beginning to see potentially a reorientation again by the Russian forces to try to claim more around Bakhmut and forget the northeast again? Are they spreading themselves too thinly, added with all the points you've made about the Ukrainian advantages now? How do you look at it from the Russian perspective and trying to make gains elsewhere?
I know some of my colleagues on YouTube, every single map update that occurs on Deep State Live, they show it, but it doesn't matter. Every time Russia captures a mailbox, they pound their chests and they spike the football and they say, we're winning. Look, we just took this single wheat field. Yeah, we lost 300 tanks and 2,000 personnel over 4 months to take this wheat field, but we took it. That means we're winning. The map doesn't matter because, yes, every square inch of Ukrainian land is sovereign and it matters to Ukraine. But big picture, long arc, the real war map is Russia's treasury. The war will end when Russia runs out of money. In 2012, Putin came back into power and he sent Russia into austerity mode to save up $600 billion over the last 12 years. To get ready for this war. And the money wasn't to fight the war. He saved up $600 billion to ensure that Russia could survive sanctions for the rest of his life. Putin's an idiot. He didn't tell his financial advisors what he was going to do. So half this money was being stored in Western banks. It was frozen. But Putin still had a war chest starting at about $300 billion. When you think about, the United States is allocated $60 billion, the UK is allocated $60 billion, Finland is allocated $3.5 billion or whatever. Stack that money up compared to Russia's starting war chest of 300. And that's the real battle. That's the real map. Putin is spending. More tanks, more bombs, more jets, more air defense systems need to be made. And we've got to pay our soldiers. We actually have to pay them, which I'm sure is very humiliating for a czar. But it's the only way to get Russians to sign these contracts. So it's a huge sugar rush for the Russian economy. All of these wives of Russian soldiers in these small Siberian towns getting a $2,000 paycheck every month. It's not the guy sitting in a trench in Donetsk who's benefiting from these salaries. It's the children, the wives, and the elders of these impoverished Russian towns. But inflation is going crazy. Labor shortages in Russia, because they don't have enough people to do the work, is driving up labor costs. On top of that, sanctions. Russia can still get everything they want, but if you can't legitimately buy stuff from Western companies, there's going to be a 100%, a 200%, 300% markup to get it through Central Asia or Turkey or the Maldives or whatever. So Russia is hemorrhaging cash. On paper, their GDP is still growing. It looks booming at the moment. But inflation year over year in Russia is horrendous. It's got to be in the 22 or 24%. We're on year 3 of war, and if you ever want to pull out an exponential formula and put in 20% inflation a year, Russians are feeling this at the gas pumps. They're feeling this in the grocery stores, and it's only going to get worse next year and the year after if they continue this war.
Indeed. I want to focus a little bit, I mean, just on your point about the strategical, maybe not grand strategical, but the strategical framing. You know, territorial shifts have not really left 18% ever since the Russians first invaded, and Ukraine then made that marvelously impressive, counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region in September 22. The territorial composition has not changed. So when they're celebrating a field, literally a field, I do find it very entertaining that the sort of the Vatniks, the Kremlinites are like, oh yeah, the Ukrainians are imminent demise. But since we're on the economy a little bit, I appreciate maybe if Russia isn't your exact wheelhouse, but I did want to get your initial reaction because earlier on in the year, we saw that quite unusual first in 10 years reshuffle in Putin's government, Shoigu switching across to the Security Council, and Belousov becoming the defense minister. But Belousov is an economic guy. He's a finance guy. What does this tell us about the Russian approach to this? It's a wartime economy. And generally, any other thoughts you've got about... actually, one last point. When this was happening, I made a video about the reaction because one of the things the Kremlinites like to celebrate is the ruble to the dollar, right? They were celebrating it had gone down from 93 to 87. But if you look at the long-term time horizon, in 2014, it was $33 rubles to a dollar, right? So they're very selective and, propagandist in what they're showing. What's your takeaways from this reshuffle and generally Russia's economic state?
You know, the price of the ruble to dollar in 2014, it's human nature to focus on the short term. It's just easier for the human brain to comprehend last 3 days, last 3 weeks, last 3 months. It's hard to think about, what was it 10 years ago? Like, we just don't feel that the same. So I just want to make that comment. But concerning the political reshuffling of Russia's defense minister, Shoigu was corrupt and Shoigu was incompetent, but he was loyal. He never betrayed Putin. He did and said everything Putin wanted him to do and say. So Shoigu, as of now, has not been pushed out a window or been served a special cup of tea. So Putin knew that he needed to change up. And Putin thinks he's pretty smart. So Putin put in charge of the military an economist, Belousov. And this serves 2 purposes. One, Putin wants somebody who understands economic and business in order to clamp down on corruption in the military and to convert the Russian economy into a permanent wartime economy. War is what we do in Russia. War is going to be Russia's main export behind oil and gas. But also I think Putin wanted somebody in charge of the military with no military experience. If you're scared about losing power or having a palace coup, then the defense minister is probably going to be part of that coup group. I don't think Shoigu ever had the spine to do that, but Putin wanted to change him, and he wanted to change him with somebody with no military experience that wouldn't be a threat to him. So Belousov shows up in meetings wearing a civilian suit. He doesn't even have a military uniform. So the idea that the military would ever commit a coup against Putin when the guy in charge of the military is an economist, this makes Putin sleep better at night. He feels more comfortable knowing that a bean counter is in charge of the military and not somebody like Sorovikin, somebody with actual command and military experience who has the admiration and respect of his soldiers.
But Do you not think that there is a concern here that if Putin is making these changes and what we have seen to be a more resilient Russian economy, that perhaps the end result of, to quote Jason Smart, who we had on the show, the change is going to come from within Russia, right? Not necessarily on the battlefield. I was quite surprised Jason said that he didn't think that the Ukrainians would win the war outright. It was more about Russia being unable to continue. That coupled with giving Ukraine as much as we can would be the deciding factor. You disagree with that notion. You think it is about giving Ukraine everything and whether or not Russia internally fragments.
No. Giving Ukraine everything they need will precipitate some kind of economic or political crisis inside of Russia. I agree with Jason J. Smart.
Right.
I think the most likely scenario for this war to end is for there to be a political or economic crisis inside of Russia, and the military just can't continue, and they pull out of the occupied territories. There's so much turmoil and disruption internally that the troops want to go home, and they don't want to fight this war anymore. They're not willing to fight this war anymore. Your $2,000 check a month can't even buy groceries for the month for your family. So yeah, there's a lot more we could be doing to precipitate this, but the idea that we're going to give Ukraine every weapon they need to go on the offensive, that would be a lot of Ukrainian soldiers would die, in my opinion, going on the offensive to liberate all the territory, while Russia can still perfectly regenerate their forces inside of Russia. Right. If Ukraine is killing 1,000 a day and Russia is recruiting 1,000 a day, well, that's a standstill. Even if we give Ukraine more weapons and Ukraine starts killing 2,000 Russian soldiers a day, we know what Russia's going to do. They're just going to start conscripting, drafting, mobilizing 2,000 a day to make up for their losses. So there has to be a spark at home. There has to be some kind of political or economic crisis so bad, like we haven't seen since Russia in the 90s or Russia in the late 1910s. But yeah, it's history has shown us it's possible, and it's likely if Putin continues on this path.
Yeah, I agree. I think, someone who's studied Russia as I have for my education, it's 1917. You shifted from World War I to the Civil War. And it's not really something that Russia is not known for, is these moments of major, or even the 3-day coup in August 1991 with Yeltsin and the tank. I mean, fascinating, and the White House, although not that kind of White House. Okay, let's bring it back to the battlefront a little bit more. You mentioned about giving Ukraine the right equipment, and obviously the thing that we've mentioned in passing multiple times is jets. You've mentioned the drones. I would be curious to hear a little bit more from you what the drones are doing with, just how much they are overwhelming the Russians. But also, when are we going to see F-16s? And what do you think that they could do?
That was news yesterday that the Netherlands signed, the Dutch defense minister signed the export license paperwork to send these first F-16s to Ukraine. All they said is soon, but you can't rush this. You can't force this. If not everything is in place, if you don't have the maintainers, if you don't have the air defense systems, if you don't have the landing strips, if you don't have the logistics and everything set up, you can't do it. As much as we want it, as much as we want it now, as much as we wanted F-16s a year ago or 2 years ago, it's a practical impossibility until it's possible. So I do think with Patriot systems being donated from Germany, the Netherlands, Romania, and the United States, these 4 additional Patriot systems showing up on the front lines. And then, this class of maintainers graduating in Denmark, the export license in the Netherlands. There's a lot of signals saying that this is happening soon. I thought last month was the month. I was wrong. I can say this month is the month. But once again, you can't do it until it's possible. So we're going to see it. But as soon as F-16s arrive, additional capabilities will be given to the Ukrainians as far as what missiles and ordnance can you fit under an F-16. And there's a lot of ordnance. There's a lot of missiles in the NATO inventory because everything on the ground that we can give Ukraine, we've given Ukraine. Everything that's surplus, excess, aged out of service life, on the ground, we can give Ukraine. So we need this additional capability, F-16s, and every missile and ordnance that can be paired with an F-16. Ukraine's going to get it. They're going to get their pilots up in the skies, and they're going to be launching off everything that they can strap to an F-16 to make the Russians howl.
Okay, but a follow-up on this, and then I want to turn to the maritime element. But, you know, we talked about red lines. They've not exactly been followed through, not that I ever really thought they would, mainly because they haven't been so far, is, you know, if we start seeing F-16s flying around and they start making incursions into Russian territory, that's a bit more than a drone. That's a bit more than an artillery strike. Could we actually see that become the point where the Russians, Putin, does begin to make more mention of, even if it's a limited tactical nuke? You know, are you not worried about escalation and the inability to consider unintended consequences from that?
So on day 2 of this war, day 2, Russia went on TV, Putin went on Russian state TV, and he said, we're raising the DEFCON. We're raising the alert status of our nuclear forces to deter NATO from helping Ukraine. On day 2 of the war, Putin was saying, if you deliver a ham sandwich to Kyiv in support of Kyiv, I will nuke you. That's where we started. And, you know, delivering NLAWs, delivering Javelins, delivering HIMARS, delivering Leopards, delivering Abrams, delivering Patriot systems, delivering ATACMS. All of these red lines, in my opinion, have been placed by us. We're the ones, you know, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, is the one saying, well, that's a red line we should place on ourselves so that Russia doesn't get out of control. If Russia could use a nuclear weapon in any way that would benefit Russia, they would have done it by now. But there's no benefits. Show me a map where they can nuke. Helsinki, Copenhagen, Berlin, Kharkiv, Odessa. Where can Russia nuke that will cause Ukraine to unconditionally surrender and for NATO to not respond in any way? There's nowhere on a map you can nuke. Russia's looked at the map. They've done the cost-benefit analysis. They've done the likely scenarios. And if Russia uses a nuke, the top 2 reasons, they don't know how India and China would react. If India and China participate in economic sanctions, that's lights out for Russia. President Xi has told Putin, under no circumstances can you use a nuke. And the second one is, the only reason why Putin is still alive is because he hasn't used a nuclear weapon. The CIA and Western intelligence is not trying to assassinate Putin because they think he's a rational actor who will not use his 6,000 nuclear warheads. But as soon as you're the guy using a nuke in your war of convenience, I'm sorry, you got to go underground and you can never come to the surface again. Putin's going to have to pick his favorite command bunker and then just stay there for the rest of his life. Because if he comes back to the surface, a Hellfire missile will be waiting for him. If you're the guy in charge of Russia and you're casually using nukes, you don't get to be alive anymore. I'm sorry. So the dream scenario for the people at the highest levels of Western intelligence, they want Putin to realize his mistake, retreat back to his own country. He can stay in power as long as he doesn't use nuclear weapons. That's the one rule. The one rule. And he can't break it. And he knows that.
Yeah, it's a compelling argument. And frankly, no, I think, head of state that wants to have the legacy like Putin wants to be seen as the guy who, as we said in one of our previous videos, which people can find on screen and in the description, is, you know, Putin wants to be the guy who reestablished the almighty Russia, be it that Soviet Union or Imperial Russia equivalent, right? So to use a nuke would be going against that. But to your point, I mean, on China, just a little bit then, I wrote an article for Kiev Post arguing the fact that the pacts between North Korea and Vietnam are not really as supported by China as many Kremlinites would like to believe or claim, right? China doesn't want the international system to be completely wrecked or disturbed, right? It wants to reform the system, and any such action by Russia would do that. So where do you think China could come in more in sort of trying to restrain Russia's military actions? Or it's not, it doesn't matter about military, just as long as it's not nuclear.
China and Russia have an interesting history, going back to their century of humiliation between 1850 and 1950. The Western colonial powers carved up China. And since 1950, The Communist Party has reclaimed all their territory from those evil colonial powers. All their territory except the territory that Russia took. Outer Manchuria and Vladivostok has been Chinese territory for thousands of years. The Russians took it by war, and they boxed in the Chinese. The Chinese don't have access to the Pacific Ocean. If they want to get their navy out, it has to go through the first island chain. Mm-hmm. And the United States has military bases all through the first island chain to keep China boxed in. Mm-hmm. So the Russians and the United States are working together to keep China boxed in. There is this reports that Russia is going to give up the Tumen River, this tiny river that connects North Korea and Russia, and the Chinese are going to get it. They're going to dredge the river, widen the river, and then use it for commercial purposes. That's fascinating. China, I think, has accepted the position that this is a win-win. As long as the West and the Russians are fighting each other, they're distracted. They're not thinking about, they're not focusing on China. And if they weaken each other, then if you believe the world is a zero-sum game, then that means that China has to be benefiting. So if Russia does politically collapse, economically collapse, China can send their peacekeepers into Outer Manchuria to bring stability to the provinces. And if for some reason Russia wins in Ukraine and Russia's allowed to keep territory, well, then the international rules-based order doesn't exist anymore. And China can do whatever they want to their smaller neighbors. If China wants to make a move in Central Asia militarily, if they, of course, want to tangle with Taiwan or their maritime bordering countries such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, China's big, and they know they're big. And China wants to be a great power. And when you're big and powerful, you think you have the right to do whatever you want to your smaller neighbors. Russia believes this. China believes this. What kind of world do we want to live in? That's the question we in the West want to think about. And is this something that we're willing to fight for?
Fascinating about this dredging of the river. I haven't read that, actually. I'm very well aware of the conflicts between the senior Soviets, it was late 1960s, early 70s, I think, when they fought over Manchuria a little bit. And I always retain that belief that, the more climate change, global warming melts the ice caps, China announcing in a white paper in 2018 that they're a near Arctic power. I think we do begin to see the limitations of these two, this mutual relationship based on, commonality of anti-US sentiment, but that's not how you build a long-term relationship alliance, is it? Very curious for your, completely pivoting back to Crimea, very curious for your thoughts on the strike on the beach, which was obviously actually for Belbek naval base or whatever it was, airfield. And obviously the Kremlinites suggesting that this was a United States deliberate attack on the beach. They're US-made missiles, but the Ukrainians said that they were intercepted by the Russian air defense. And it's quite clearly the air defense systems are what the shrapnel was their defense systems. What is going on here? Can you help us make sense of it?
The idea that the Ukrainians would deliberately waste a very limited and valuable ATACMS missile to go after some women and kids on a beach is pretty laughable. If the Ukrainians just wanted to randomly commit acts of terrorism and kill Russians, there are cheaper and easier ways to do that. You don't have to dedicate an expensive, limited ATACMS missile when you can use artillery or drones on the other side of the border, in Sumy or Chernihiv. If your goal is just to randomly kill Russian civilians, acts of terrorism. So it's obvious, yes, the Ukrainians were using an ATACMS to target either the Belbek airfield or the naval port of Sevastopol. This stupid vacation beach is located between a Russian Air Force base and a Russian naval base that are being bombed all the time. It's so stupid that Russia is still encouraging their civilians to vacation between two top priority military targets. On top of that, the Russians have constructed no cement structures for anyone to shelter, and there's no air raid sirens, and there's no text alerts when there's incoming missiles. So when Russia fired off the ATACMS from Kherson or Mykolaiv or wherever, they're in the sky, traveling, and the Russians know about them. And they choose not to tell their people. They choose not to warn their civilians of incoming missiles because they want to pretend like everything's fine. vacation in glorious Crimea, the jewel of the Russian Empire, where czars have been vacationing for centuries, be whisked away to the magical vacation destination. Like it's so stupid. Like it just fits the Russians so perfectly. So yeah, obviously, Russia's air defense systems shot down this cluster variant of the ATACMS, and the munitions fell on this beach, killing at least 4 Russian vacationers. So, condolences, my sympathies to innocent civilians, but they're also not very bright. And I do think the Russian government was complicit in this act, responsible for the death of their own people.
Yes, I'm largely in agreement. As someone who's been to that beach and Sevastopol and been on a Russian sub in 2006 and 5, I could tell you that it's not the most, I mean, the way that they've done the pictures, it looks like a nice beach and the water is marvelous, but it's between 2 major military assets. I don't understand how that's sort of appealing, but somehow it is. And thank you. You've now made me have to think about how I'm going to get my editor to add like some kind of, overlaying sort of welcome to the magical world of Crimea sort of effect. So that's important. What about, though, the maritime element in this? I did mention it early on, and I am very interested in this because relative to what we've seen, the proclaimed wins for the Russians on the terrestrial side, the Ukrainians, by actual default, are literally making the Black Sea a graveyard for naval assets of the Russian Navy. Why is this so successful for the Ukrainians? And what should Westerners maybe... Because the other thing, actually, just on that point, what I'm learning is that we're learning quite a lot from the Ukrainians in terms of their ingenuity of using certain assets in quite unique ways. What's some of the things you've seen on the maritime front?
The Russian Black Sea Fleet no longer operates in the Black Sea. They're launching their Caliber cruise missiles from the Sea of Azov. So they've been sinking barges to the entrance to the Kerch Strait Bridge. And it's, Ukrainian naval drones. Ukraine's naval drone strikes going back to last year and the first half of this year were so successful. Left the Black Sea. They're hiding behind their bridge in the Sea of Azov. And soon they're not even going to be safe there. Once F-16s arrive, they're going to get anti-ship missiles. I don't know the range and how far it is for an F-16 to get close to the Zaporizhia front. All of these ships are going to be destroyed. It's just a matter of time. As long as Russia continues this war, they're going to lose everything. It's so bad for Russia that Romania, Turkey, and Bulgaria are going to help Ukraine demine the Black Sea. They're taking all the mines out because it's a bigger threat to commercial shipping than it is to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which doesn't exist in the Black Sea anymore. Russia has lost the naval war to a country without a navy.
It's like the 4th most successful military entity in Europe was the Ukrainian farmers, if I'm not incorrectly remembering. Okay, Jake. So last couple of questions for you is more forward-looking. What could you expect in the next few months from the Western perspective in terms of its provisions to Ukraine? We touched upon that in part 1 with the diplomacy, foreign policy kind of perspective, but what about in the militaristic sense on the ground? And then I've got one last question for you.
When it comes to the people on Russia's border, Finland just announced their 24th or something military aid package. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have all committed to sending 0.25% of their GDP to Ukraine. So this is not what they're spending on themselves. This is on top of what they're spending on themselves. They want to have a pure donation system to Ukraine. And this is the correct attitude for Finland and the Baltics and Poland. If you can fight the Russians not on your territory, it's not your cities being destroyed. They should be doing everything they can to prevent the next war on their territory. But the rest of NATO, it's once again just what do we have laying around? What's stuff we're going to be decommissioning soon? What is our excess capacity? It's enough at the moment. It's enough to keep the front line stabilized. Ukraine is holding the line. And next 6 months, we're fine. But we really need the Democrats to win in Congress and for Joe Biden to be reelected. Otherwise, starting next year, Donald Trump is going to cut off all help for Ukraine. I have no doubt about this. So next year is going to get precarious if Donald Trump wins. And I think the Russians know this, and The Russians are hoping for it. I mean, they're basically planning on it at this point.
And a hypothetical to end our conversation, but one of the biggest, I don't know if you call it an asset, but approaches maybe that Putin seems to adopt is strategical patience. The hope that the disunity within the West, war fatigue, the inevitable election of Trump, at least he hopes, will ultimately yield him a win, not from his own self, but from, So what would you suggest? What would be some recommendations, advice you would say in the short to medium term for the rest of 2024 to be it Ukraine, Europe, Americans, people who are watching? Any takeaways?
We're 2.5 years into this war. Any fatigue that Westerners feel, that's what they've already felt for probably the last 2 years. People were very engaged the first 6 months. There was all this hope that Russia would accept the overtures or the off-ramp and they would de-escalate, and that didn't happen. So yeah, I mean, for people still talking about Western fatigue, it's been 2.5 years. This is the normal. This is the new normal. Whatever you're doing, you can keep doing it until Ukraine can win this war, until Russia collapses. We never talk about Russian fatigue or what do the people of Russia feel? And Russia's a dystopian nightmare. I just saw a clip yesterday where this deputy finance minister in St. Petersburg was saying they've got legislation in the pipeworks to ban extremist ideology that women can live a normal life without children. If you advocate it's okay as a Russian woman to go childless your entire life, you will be arrested and put in jail. That's the first step. The next step is, once again, just forcing Russian women to have more kids. The quote from the deputy finance minister is real. Russia is working on legislation to control the narrative inside Russia because Putin wants more babies. Russian fatigue will exhaust the Russian system before Western fatigue does anything to NATO or the West. That's the argument I want to make.
Well, and on that, Jake, I think that is very pertinent. I think we often forget that, the West is not just one singular entity. It's a collective. And for that collective of not just 32 nations and NATO, but even more, to still be banding together. And I would still like to point out that I think the majority of countries around the world don't really support Putin's war, even if they're not doing anything to sort of support Ukraine. I think the sentiment is there that this, to bring it back to what we originally talked about, the use of might is right. At the end of our first conversation, right? This Putin has legitimized the usage of hard power as a way to get what he wants, which is a scary thought. But we'll just have to have you back maybe in a few more months to take a look, maybe prior to the US election. Hopefully it's as boring as anything and Biden wins. But thank you very much, Jake.
It's a fantastic. Okay. I just want to say it's a fantastic trick that the Russians have convinced the global South that they were never a colonial power. If you hate the old French Empire, British Empire, American interventionism, if you hate those people, we're your friend. When 150 years ago, the Russian Empire was called an empire, and you can't be an empire unless you've colonized people, unless you've stolen territory to expand. So I'm disappointed in the global South if we want to lump them all together, if people or governments support Russia. Because they're saying the people of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe don't matter. They never suffered under colonialism or imperial rule. To say that their version of colonialism and suffering under empires was more legitimate or worse than what the people of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia have endured for centuries under the czars, it was pretty bad. It was pretty bad under the czars, and I think this is a conversation and a talking point we should be highlighting more to people from the global South.
Well, that's an opening, an avenue for us to have you back to talk about that very thing. Someone who spent a lot of time across Africa, I could tell you that there is a lot of anti-Western sentiment. But the point I always try to emphasize to people is I'm not defending the West, but what Russia is providing you, offering you, is no different. What is happening in Niger, what is happening in Chad is no different to what you are angry about the French, the Brits, and whoever, did and also to joke, but the scramble of Africa didn't involve Russia for one singular reason. Navy was crap. And the Army was the only thing they had. But Jake, I look forward to having you back. Thank you very much for your time. Everyone, if you enjoyed the conversation, give it a like, give it a share. Really helps the growing channel. And do check out Jake's show. Obviously, I presume most of you are from there and you know who this mastermind is. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next one. As always, wish you peace of mind. Take care.